District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Welcome to a special roundup episode of the show. I'm going to be highlighting Interior Secretarial Order 3447, the President embracing consumer-regulated electricity to help address rising electricity demand, and today's important meeting between the U.S., Greenland, and Denmark. I'll start with Secretarial Order 3447 and its significance to this recalibration, realignment of conservation with public lands access. During the Biden-Harris administration, public lands access was caveated by very interesting criteria, such as climate change, obscure ESG factors, and jargon that really had no bearing on conservation. And we had seen a lot of access to public land opportunities, whether it was in the form of hunting opportunities that were lost, fishing opportunities that were lost, all the while national monuments would get expanded to prepare them to become national parks. And there are some rare cases where that is appropriate, but the Biden administration, under their 30 by 30 so-called America the Beautiful plan, weaponized national monuments to depress access on historically open public lands to hunting and fishing. I see the Secretarial Order as a course correction to those 4 years of misguided policymaking at the Department of Interior. Here are some takeaway items from the Secretarial Order, which is 7 pages long. I also have a reel on my social media accounts breaking down the significance of this. Secretarial Order 3447, expanding hunting and fishing access, removing unnecessary barriers, and ensuring consistency across the Department of Interior lands and waters. It will direct the 11 or so various different bureaus and offices to direct and remove unnecessary regulatory or administrative barriers to hunting and fishing on DOI managed lands and waters, expand access and opportunities where compatible with law, refuge purposes, park enabling statutes, reclamation, area requirements, safety and conservation needs, improve coordination and regulatory alignment with state, tribal, and territorial wildlife agencies, and elevate any proposed reduction or incompatibility determination involving hunting or fishing to appropriate bureau or office leadership for transparent and accountable review. What I thought were some interesting takeaways. Expanding under department-wide directives, expanding hunting and fishing opportunities, reducing unnecessary regulatory burden, and land use planning integration. There was also a section about particular bureau-specific directives. Under the Fish and Wildlife Service, there is a section about compatibility determination, that CD involving hunting or fishing shall be elevated to the director for review and approval. CDs proposing restrictions must be supported by clear documented justification, citing specific statutory requirements, public safety concerns, or biological considerations. Annual hunting and fishing rulemaking, the Fish and Wildlife Service shall identify, advance all viable new openings, expansion through annual hunting and sport fishing rulemaking process. There's also the section about lead, ammunition, and tackle. It's nice to see no outright ban on that because the studies are inconclusive as to whether a wholesale ban would actually help whatsoever. Restrictions on lead ammunition or tackle may not be included in station-specific regulations except in rare cases where there are site-specific, species-specific, scientific evidence demonstrating a direct population impact. Bureau of Land Management lands, in terms of what they require, they say it should be in accordance, consistent with FLPMA, which is a law that governs public land access, specific authorities, state wildlife management frameworks, review all closure, supplemental rules, special regulations that limit hunting, fishing access, methods of take, prioritize expansion of hunting and fishing opportunities. National Park Service, it should be in accordance with National Park Service organic applicable to enabling statutes, relevant congressional authorizations, to review compendiums and park-specific regulations, identifying restrictions on hunting and fishing that exceed statutory mandates or unit-enabling authorities, and determine where modifications may be appropriate. So maybe some hunting and fishing restored on national parks. You can fish in some national parks, by the way, but hunting is severely limited. So that would be interesting if that would be enhanced there. So they talk a lot more, and it went into effect immediately. So, like I said, I think this is a course correction to the climate first agenda that we saw under the previous administration, which basically took out wildlife management decisions, put them on the back burner, deprioritized scientific-based, science-led wildlife management decisions. And this was very evident in the BIDA rule, governing Fish and Wildlife Service access and governance over national wildlife refuges. I wrote this for Town Hall in 2024. That was perhaps one of the most egregious examples where they were mismanaging wildlife refuges and conditioning access to climate mitigation or climate provision adoptions. Now we have practical conservation-based, true conservation-based guidelines that seem to be governing public lands access. And anytime access is enhanced or broadened, we like that and celebrate that. And I think this is good to see, especially since the admin has been so invested in energy development, which is a very big priority of Department of Interior, especially federal oil and gas leases on public lands, how you manage that with conservation and access. So I like that they're also supporting and showcasing this side of the agency, which needs to be highlighted more. So I'm curious to see how this framework will be adopted even more and broaden access and not politicize access like we saw previously. We've talked about this novel concept called consumer-regulated electricity that is starting to gain traction in the States and also nationally. I had Travis Fisher from the Cato Institute talk about this idea. It's a policy reform. You can go back to our episode from a couple weeks back if you need a primer or an introduction into this concept. But to put it into layman's terms, what consumer-regulated electricity does, we have electricity markets that are divided into two categories, regulated and deregulated. FERC, which is a national entity regulating electricity markets, oversees these electricity markets, but it's actually the states that decide what type of policies, what type of energy sources go into the grid or affect grid reliability. And under the Federal Power Act, states are actually given exclusive authority to determine their electricity politics. So when you see a lot of people blaming rising electricity demand on fossil fuel industry, utilities, and other factors, not bad state policy making, that's why there's a lot of confusion and blame assigned to AI data centers, which don't really account right now, even with their proliferation, into higher energy bills. In the future, that could happen if the grid is strained and overloaded. But right now, it's not really AI data centers that are explaining this higher electricity rate, higher utility bills, especially in blue states across the country. And this is not me playing partisan games. This is me looking at data. I look at the government data. I'm looking at the Energy Information Administration, which tells you the average utility rates in different regions across the country, different states across the country. And this data was used recently and highlighted in a very important report titled Blue States High Rates, which showed that in states with green mandates or climate mandates, they saw above average electricity rates. This was backed up from research from Always on Energy Research by Mitch Rolling and Isaac Orr, who found that even in their analysis in a state like Virginia, which is data center alley because we have May East fiber optic network, which is why we have so many data centers. We have 15% of American data centers located here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we have below average electricity prices, even with all that considered. So for me right now, AI data centers are not largely what is driving higher prices. What is driving higher prices, as I've talked about and alluded to here on the show, are green mandates in various different states and also the premature shutdown of power plants. If you're looking at states like California, Maryland, Hawaii, the Northeast, even the Great Lakes states, chances are those states have adopted a cornucopia of different policies that have invited higher prices. Let's say the Northeast, for example, New England in particular. Most of those states belong to a cap and trade deal called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Virginia and Pennsylvania have exited that agreement because it was even too extreme for these two states, including my adopted state of Virginia, to belong to that. It was not reducing carbon emissions as it said it would. It's very costly to so-called carbon-intensive goods and services, and ultimately it will drive out businesses from states with that. And states that live under RGGI saw above average increases in electricity prices. So one study from the Lawrence Lab from University of California at Berkeley. I should know this. I'm a UC graduate. I didn't go to Berkeley, but it's the UC system. So this one laboratory operating out of UC Berkeley did a study on factors that explain why electricity rates are higher in blue states to supplement this blue states high rate study. They found that in RGGI states that they were paying an exorbitant amount of money across the last 5 years. So I was able to calculate that in the Northeast, particularly in the New England states, they've been paying they're paying now 29% more on average, cumulatively, for electricity compared to 5 years ago. And that's not a coincidence because of all the green mandates to go 100% renewables. There are, within each different state, they even have some more extreme measures in effect. They have renewable portfolio standards, which mandate that a certain percentage of your electric grid has to be renewables. Some states may have 40%. New York State, I believe, had 70%. I think they're clamping down or watering down those requirements now because of rising electricity demand, because of natural gas being put into the equation, nuclear being approved, especially in the case of New York. And New York is not New England, for context. So you have RGGI, which is driving up costs. You have renewable portfolio standards. You have these green mandates to phase out fossil fuel usage by arbitrary deadlines like 2050. You even have, in the case of Vermont, a climate super fund, which makes it so oil and gas companies, which really don't have any business operations too much in Vermont, to pay for so-called damages against the climate. Like I said, even amongst these blue states, there might be crazier policies there. As I alluded to with the Federal Power Act, states have almost exclusive power to set their electricity policies in terms of the sources that they adopt, what goes onto the grid, and the policies that govern grid operation. When you know this, you'll then understand why you see blue states experiencing higher than average, abominable electricity hikes, and why in red states which don't have these mandates, they do see, with a couple exceptions, traditionally lower rates. Right now, if you're looking at the EIA, what states come out and stick out as having the highest electricity rates in the country? So it's volleying back and forth between Hawaii and California. Those usually have been the number one and number two spot. They kind of trade spots. Hawaii, because they're such an isolated state and they primarily run on petroleum oil, but they also have green mandates as well. California has the highest gas tax in all of the United States, so they are number two traditionally, and they also have some pretty extreme climate measures in effect. You also do see Alaska in the top 10 because, again, it's further away, but Alaska does not have green mandates whatsoever in their state. But the top 10 most expensive states for electricity costs tend to be blue states. This is what you can find in the government data, which is why consumer regulated electricity, going back to CRE, is a remedy. So you're concerned about rising electricity rates. You're concerned about AI data centers. You want to see some more flexibility and competition in electricity markets. What do you do with the bottlenecks and transmission issues and the refusal to approve more reliable energy projects, or this insistence that we have to have 100% renewables? So states are grappling with this crunch and this blockage because of the aging grid and also because of bad policy making. So what's a natural remedy that we're seeing adopted in states like New Hampshire, as Travis Fisher talked about, and even Senator Tom Cotton proposing a federal version of this in the Senate called the Data Act? Now you see President Trump taking it to Truth Social to basically demand, without calling it by its name, for consumer regulated electricity. And he is concerned, and everyone should be concerned, doesn't matter if you're red or blue, how you vote, if you're paying utility bills, you should be really concerned that bad policy making, particularly from the state level, is what is causing our rates to go up. Federal policy can affect certain things in terms of compelling states to accord themselves with national standards, but as we see now, you have a admin that is for energy abundance and not that of net zero. And if you force states to go net zero and adopt that federally, that can explain at the federal side of things, making costs more expensive. But again, the power rests under the states. Again, check the Federal Power Act. That is what governs state law and an exclusive power of states to determine their electricity politics. So President Trump took it to Truth Social saying, under sleepy Joe Biden and the radical left Democrats, the average American household utility bills went up massively, over 30%. I never want Americans to pay higher electricity bills because of data centers. Therefore, my administration is working with major American technology companies to secure their commitment to the American people, and we will have much to announce in the coming weeks. First up is Microsoft, who my team has been working with and which will make major changes beginning this week to ensure Americans don't, quote, pick up the tab, and, quote, for their power consumption in the form of paying higher utility bills. We are the hottest country in the world and number one in AI. Data centers are key to that boom and keeping Americans free and secure, but the big technology companies who build them must pay their own way. This is exactly what consumer electricity, this is my commentary now, calls for. Behind the meter, they will pay for adopting their own electricity, becoming their own utility operators, essentially. With that, thank you and congratulations to Microsoft. More to come soon, President DJT. So we see kind of a tacit but not direct endorsement of consumer regulated electricity. This is a thing you're going to be hearing about at the state legislature more. ALEC adopted a framework, and you're now going to see more states like New Hampshire adopt a similar posture, a similar policy. And this is not exclusive to red states. So New Hampshire goes back and forth. It's kind of purple. We even see Illinois looking to adopt CRE at their legislature. If you don't like utilities having monopolistic power, it's only natural to support something like this. If you want innovation, if you want the grid to not be strained, CRE is a perfectly good example of a reform to support. And I'm looking in my professional capacity to support it. You'll see that from me soon. Last but not least, let's touch on this meeting that transpired between some of our foreign ministers, the vice president, and the foreign ministers of Denmark and Greenland. Ahead of talks between our countries, there have been efforts and gestures by the United States, my country, to purchase or threaten invasion of Greenland. We even saw a bill introduced in Congress by Congressman Randy Fine to annex Greenland, bringing that to a vote in Congress, which might be the more appropriate place to do it. Nevertheless, the idea of purchasing Greenland from Denmark and putting boots on the ground are extremely unpopular. And I'm not saying this to diminish America's standing in the Arctic or us having a greater standing in the Arctic. I do believe that. I think you could hold these twin views of not supporting drastic measures, but also believing we should have some play in the Arctic because Russia and China are seriously eyeing that region. It's been well documented. I want to point you to the words of NATO Supreme Commander General Grinkiewicz, a very serious guy. Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, General Alexis Grinkiewicz, said in a recent statement that Russia and China are increasingly working together in sync in the Arctic region, saying that it'll be a growing threat to all NATO allies and countries that have some immediacy to the Arctic region. General Grinkiewicz said, quote, "It's not for peaceful purposes in terms of Russia and China's activity in the Arctic. They're not studying the seals and the polar bears. They're out there doing bathymetric surveys and trying to figure out how they can counter NATO capabilities on and under the sea. So that's something that could grow very quickly, and we need to be mindful of it and ready for it." Most Americans in a recent poll, I think it's 86%, said that an invasion would be inappropriate of Greenland. When you talk to Greenlanders themselves, do they want to become American? Do they want to be Danish? Or do they want to be independent? Overwhelmingly, almost of those same figures, near 90% of them say they don't want to become American. And in their most recent survey, when elections were held, they said they would ideally like to be independent of Denmark, which governs them as a protectorate. But in wake of some of the heightened talks and exchanges on social media, you had seen the prime ministers of both Greenland and Denmark come out and say that we are one and the same. Denmark is going to guarantee Greenland's security in the interim. There's a united front between them. It's going to be really difficult for the U.S., in my personal opinion, for them to break them. And it seems like they didn't budge in the talks that had transpired over the last few hours as of this recording. Here's what the U.S. should be doing with its posture in Greenland, without resorting to boots on the ground or outright purchases, because to purchase Greenland, I don't know if you guys know what the conservative estimates are. It's about $3 trillion. Do we have that kind of money sitting around with our rising debt? We have nearly $38 trillion in debt. Can we afford to do that? Can we buy Greenlanders and their favor to convince them to become American? Even if you entice them with money, it doesn't seem like that is the case. Also, politically, Greenland is very socialist. I learned recently that there is basically no private property. It's like 99% government controlled. So that would be a pretty big financial burden for us to take with people who are not necessarily attitudinally American. Well, what's more realistic, I've talked about this with past guests of the program who wrote the great book, So You Want to Buy Greenland, Dr. Elizabeth Buchanan. That was a couple months ago. I believe that was around early November. I had spoken to her on Halloween. We recorded that Halloween. I put that out shortly afterwards, early November. I'll be plugging in her episode in this Roundup podcast too, because I think you should go back and listen to our discussion there about should the U.S. buy Greenland? What's going to be the ultimate solution here? Can the three parties come together? Can the U.S. have and assert itself more in Greenland? I think the option is yes. But even though there's a stalemate right now, I think what's been happening with foreign policy decisions as it relates to critical minerals, because there is a tie-in here with conservation and critical minerals, the serious discussions, the negotiations are going to happen behind the scenes on two grounds. Militarily, you will see a renegotiating, most likely, of the Defense of Greenland Act, which allowed the U.S. to have a military presence in Greenland as far back as World War II. There has been a drawdown of U.S. bases since World War II. There used to be a handful. Now there's only one. So I can see once the back and forth on social media dies down and the real negotiations take place behind the scenes, we could see some sort of retooling and amending and perhaps broadening of the scope of that defensive agreement we already have with Denmark. Number two, as it relates to critical minerals, natural resources, if we haven't ticked off Denmark and Greenland too much, I think they would still be open to entering into economic partnerships with the United States because they are home to about 25 of 31 essential critical minerals. China, Russia, Europe, the United States, we're all eyeing these deposits of critical minerals. And I will wager we're not going to be getting a lot of these critical minerals, including rare earth elements, largely from Denmark. We have a lot sitting here in the United States that can be safely explored and developed. But strategically and militarily, it makes sense for the U.S. to have, because we do have some proximity to the Arctic if you look at our geography. Economically, if we want to have good rapport with Greenland, whether it's critical minerals, perhaps it's increased tourism opportunities, fly fishing, sporting opportunities, specifically, Northern Lights adventures, fly fishing. I think that could be a smarter way to foster greater ties, not step on Denmark's toes, and to stave off Russian and Chinese aggression in the Arctic. Energy and natural resources issues continue to pop up in these foreign policy discussions, which I think it's appropriate to discuss here on the podcast. I'm not shy away from doing that. I'm a pretty analytical person. I like to draw connections to different things. Also, conservation is so multifaceted. Natural resources has a lot of global implications, so it would be a lost opportunity if we did not talk about these subjects here on the podcast. So as listeners know, I'm very, very conservative. I like many of the policies that are being administered by the Trump administration. I agree with them about having a greater posture in the Arctic region. Anyone who tells you otherwise is not paying attention. They don't know what time it is. But I don't agree, and I don't think it's practical to suggest that we're going to put boots on the ground or we're going to outright buy Denmark. You saw in today's press conference, I was looking over some clips, they said Greenland is not for sale. And this was said on a united front between Denmark and Greenland. So you can't outright purchase a country without the consent of the other partner or the potential buyer. So that is out of the window. Military activity in Greenland would be extremely unpopular, and I saw reports that the Joint Chief of Staffs were even opposed to that idea. The optics would look terrible. We're not at war with Denmark. We're not at war with Greenland. So I think this is a nuanced approach that conservatives and non-conservatives can have alike. Let's hope cooler heads prevail here, and I think we will see an amenable solution where all parties are satisfied. We maintain territorial integrity, and the U.S. can have greater muscle in the Arctic and stave off Chinese and Russian aggression there. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.